Hello, everybody, and welcome to, oh, wait, it's not quite Virtual Trek Con. It's Jake Sisko on writing, featuring Michael Jan Friedman. How you guys doing?
Doing very well, thanks.
I almost said Virtual Trek Con, but this is actually the second in our series of Jake Sisko on writing. I guess we should say it a little more calmly, like a fireside chat. But thank you so much.
Yes, it's a very serious.
So, first things first, you've written
Thank you for being here.
dozens of books for Star Trek, dozens of Star Trek books, which is not just dozens in your lifetime of books in total. That's more like 80, I think you said. But just specifically Star Trek books, over 30. That's unbelievable. With that many that you've written, do you remember any specific ones, or is it just one big jumbled mess of cool characters and stories?
No, I do remember quite a few of them and quite a few details. But honestly, not all. Occasionally a reader will come up to me and say, "Wow, I really enjoyed the way you handled that character in such and such book," and I'll say, "That's fantastic. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I have no recollection whatsoever of it." But no, of course, I do remember quite a few of the details.
Okay. Before we get too much into it, and I know Cirroc's got a million great questions, here's a good one from Sarah Gold, who's one of our good friends. She's at Women at Warp and Star Trek Quarterly. She says, how much fun did you have writing the TNG XMen crossover, which I love, by the way. That's like the one asterisk to the Star Trek novels. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. At the time, it was a unique opportunity because at the time, Marvel had the Star Trek comic publishing license, and the editor over at Pocketbook said, "Hey, they're going to do a crossover. We can do one as well." And he asked Marvel, and they said sure. So it was of course called Planet X. And the hardest part kind of finding the right vibe, because the level of reality and the level of science in Star Trek is different from the level in the X-Men comics.
And if there even is any science in the X-Men stuff.
Right. So
a
little bit.
There's adamantium, there's Professor X. There's
good knowledge, yeah.
So in any case, I eventually leaned a lot more towards Star Trek. I guess partly because I was more familiar with it, but partly because I felt like I could explain a lot of what the X-Men did in some general Star Trek-y kind of terms. So I went that way. And I think it worked out. The Next Generation crew came across a planet that was full of kind of X-Men-like mutants, and between the X-Men who were on board and the Next Generation crew, they were able to address this threat on that planet, all the while being sympathetic to the fact that these were kind of mutants. But I had some great fun moments in there. I had Wolverine and Worf in the holodeck.
Yes, that is so cool.
I had Nightcrawler talking to Geordi about teleportation. One really fun moment that stands out in my mind was the B.G. Robinson was the transporter operator in the outrageous Icona, and she kind of falls in a moment. She kind of falls for the outrageous Icona, and that was played by Terry Hatcher.
Cool, right? We know her. Yeah.
So here's Terry Hatcher on the Enterprise, and I resurrected her character, and Archangel is flying around the ship, and Terry Hatcher, who of course was one of the stars the Superman series, right? Lois and Clark.
Right.
She looks at Archangel and she goes, "I can't believe a man can fly." So,
Which is funny because obviously
she's Lois.
Superman, yeah.
Right. So, so there were just some great moments at the end. I had Q sitting there, kind of mulling over what had happened alongside the Watcher from the Marvel continuity, and just some great fun juxtapositions. So it was a lot of fun to do. I not universally loved this book. Actually, when it first came out, there were a lot of people who were ticked off that we had kind of mixed these two continuities.
It's not canon,
right? But it was a lot of fun to do.
Right.
You know, that just reminds me that there's like a little meme that's floating around where Thanos from Avengers is saying, you know, I will destroy half of them. He's going through this whole long thing, and then Q just pops in and goes, "Oh, that guy was getting annoying," and just snaps and he disappears.
Right.
Looked like you're going to say something, Cirroc. I'm not sure.
Oh, I have a lot of questions. So yeah, I just wanted you to get the X-Men stuff out because I'm a big X-Men fan.
Me too.
Grew up reading the comics, and you know, I have a certain fascination with Wolverine and Colossus and a lot of the characters in the X-Men series. So I'm happy to hear about this crossover. It sounds like it should have been a movie or you know, something to that degree, but maybe that was too much to chew for CBS.
CBS and Fox, yeah, they wouldn't be able to get along.
I actually wrote a book, an X-Men book that had nothing to
Now,
do.
Mike, did you go to school for writing, or?
Go ahead. Did I go to school for writing? Well, I studied English literature, which, you know, let's face it, you need to know where you're coming from.
Right.
But and I did take a couple of writing independent studies where I got credit for writing a part of a novel. Not a novel that I ended up publishing, but it was a real education. I guess looking back, it was probably the most useful part of my college education because I actually got to do the thing that I would eventually end up doing. And that was, you know, that was great. But you know, I mean, I had my professor for the independent studies was a guy named Jerry Mangione, whose nephew is Chuck Mangione, right, the musician, and
Sounds Italian.
Yeah, he was Sicilian, I think by birth, and he had won the National Book Award. And as much as he kind of liked what I was doing, he said, "How does a kid from Queens write about, you know, mythology, Norse mythology and Greek?" He goes, "What possesses you to do this?" So he wasn't a geek, but he was a good writer. So I did benefit from his input.
Okay. So here's the thing. I kind of want to skip to the very end right now because I'm most excited about one particular series. I definitely want to talk about original series, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, all that stuff. But there's one thing that's a little near and dear to my heart, and that is the Stargazer series.
Oh.
I've never read it, but I think you wrote maybe 6 books of that one. And I think that's where I remember seeing your name, actually, is looking at those books and thinking, damn, there's a Stargazer series. For those of you at home, Cirroc, the Stargazer is where Picard was stationed. It was his first captaincy before the Next Generation. So we don't know anything about it. We just know that he mentioned once or twice that he was on the Stargazer. And Mike, you had the pleasure, the honor, the fun of exploring that entire world of Captain Picard before Next Generation. Can you tell us a bit about that? What was the most exciting aspect, creating the characters around him, or just exploring Picard as a younger captain, or what was it exactly?
Well, it started with Reunion, which was the first Next Generation hardcover. I kind of had already gained the trust of Paramount in terms of what I would do,
Right.
given that opportunity. And the Stargazer was first mentioned in an episode called The Battle in the first season of Next Generation. And I said, I loved shining lights on dark corners, and that was one of them. Thank you with that.
I'll be popping these on. I hope not to distract you, but there's a lot of love for Stargazer popping up right now in the comments. Please continue.
Great to see and hear. So I liked shining a light on dark corners, and that was one of them. They had mentioned one character, one crewman named Morgan, and it wasn't even clear what his thing was.
Right.
Was it Morgan? I think it was. And that was it. So there was a lot of room for improvisation, and I pitched this idea that I would do a murder mystery on board the Enterprise with Picard's original crew, and that was it was well received, and I did that, and people liked the book, so I started using those characters all over the place. I used them in the comics. I was writing the Next Gen comic at the time for DC.
Really?
Yeah, I did
Didn't
like
know that.
77 of the 80 issues. Yeah.
Oh, that's all. Just
I mean,
just 77 issues.
I still boggles my mind that I had that opportunity. But anyway, so I did other books with those characters in them, and I did eventually do a six book miniseries with the Stargazer characters.
Wow.
And the best part, as you kind of touched on, was creating this crew. That's the secret delight of all Star Trek novelists. Is creating crews. So this was my chance to do it, and there was a crew that I created. It was officers that I created for Reunion. But then in the Stargazer series, I came up with more characters, because the problem was we had already seen part of the crew in the Next Generation era, and we knew they survived.
Yeah, it's like a spoiler,
right? So to introduce some jeopardy into the mix, I created characters that we hadn't seen in the Next Generation era, so we don't know if they survive or what happens to them. So they were, they were characters that whose ends hadn't been determined yet, and they introduced some jeopardy and some uncertainty into the mix.
Very quickly, just to give a couple quick shout outs here. Tamia Harper says, I need to read this series. Jenny R. Johnson, Reunion, is sitting on my bookshelf, one of my absolute favorite Trek novels. By the way, Jenny R. Johnson is like one of the best artists in the world. She's unbelievable out in Nova Scotia. She's in our promenade, everybody, so go check her out in a couple hours and buy like a dozen of her paintings or whatever. And Melissa says that would be an interesting story to explore. Everybody's loving these. Anyway, go ahead, Cirroc. I know you were about to say something. There's a little delay, though.
Yeah, my first thought was about. Yeah, no, my thought is about canon, and is there a process where there's a regulatory body over you that says what can and cannot be included in canon, or are you free to create on your own?
Well, there is what we'll call a regulatory body. It wasn't considered canon, though. It wasn't quite considered canon, not in the way that Star Wars books were considered canon for a while. There was sort of a book canon, and you didn't want to contradict what someone else had written a few months earlier, and you couldn't contradict anything on the screen. But there was actually only, I think there was only one time that the shows on television reflected anything that was in the books. And we can talk about that one time as well. It's interesting, but what would happen is when you would, if you wanted to write a book, you had an idea, you would pitch it to the editor at Pocket Books, who would in turn pitch it to Paramount at the time. And there was a licensing office at Paramount. Some Paula Block was there. Some very good people were there. John Van Sitters, and they would review what you did and approve it or disapprove it. And so you had those two levels of approval at every stage of the process. So when you submitted your outline and when you submitted your story, and fortunately both of them were very knowledgeable and creative. The licensing people at Paramount would never just say, "Oh yeah, you can't do that." What they would say is, "Well, I don't think you can do that, but how about this?" So they were really partners in the publishing process, and they were very good in that respect. But you had those two layers of approval always, and actually when I first started, you had three layers of approval because Gene was still around, and he had an office that had to sign off on everything.
Okay. Okay. So I was going to ask, how tough they were on you, but it sounds like you kind of answered that they weren't so bad. They weren't like looming over your shoulder. They were more like partners that would come in and give like a note or two later on. That seems like a really good working relationship.
Noted for 50.
So here's one more that I've been dying to ask, because you also did another series, which was an idea that I was hoping that they would have done 15 years. I remember 15 years ago when Enterprise was going or just about to end, I remember thinking, you know what I really want to see next? A Starfleet Academy series.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and I think, and I was just like, they really got it. And now 15 years later, it looks like there is one possibly in development, but you, ahead of the game, you wrote a couple books about Starfleet Academy, right? And I have to admit, I don't know anything about it. Can you tell us what the basic premise or main characters were in that?
Sure. I'm thinking this was 25 years ago, maybe.
Wow.
We had a Starfleet Academy series. I think my friend Peter David did the first 2 or 3 books, and then I came along, and his were on Worf. Basically, Worf was the main character, and then I did a couple.
Really?
Yeah. And
does it take place in the past before, or is he more of a teacher?
No, as a student, as a
got it. Okay,
as a academy cadet.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did Data. I did a couple with Data, and I kind of modeled the titles after like the Hardy Boys or something like that. It was a little wonky, but the stories, I thought they were great stories, not just mine, but everything that was written for that. And in fact, there was, at the same time, there were Jake and Nog books written. Cirroc, are you aware of this?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I am aware. I'm aware, and people have come to me and asked me about those stories, and said, "Do you remember when you and Nog went off and did this and this?" And I'm like, "No, I don't remember that." And that's because it was in the books.
So
you mean you didn't act that out?
No.
All those books were really well written, and even though they were targeted at the target was the young adult audience, they were really the kind of books that anybody could read and enjoy. They were, I thought, really well done.
Here's a quick question from Kimber Spores, one of our good friends. She says, "What sparked your interest in writing?"
I guess broadest answer would be reading. I read, and I really enjoyed science fiction, and I read comic books that were kind of science fiction oriented characters, and I really enjoyed them, and I wanted to do that thing. Unfortunately, I didn't know anyone who did it, and I didn't know anyone who knew anyone who did it. You know, nobody on none of the fathers on my block were professional writers. There was a guy who published a science fiction digest sized magazine, um, who was like a mile from my house. And I remember going over there one time and knocking on his door because I saw the address and I said, "It's got to be the guy."
Back in the day when people would go knock on people's doors.
Yeah, right. And I was little. And I knocked on his door, and he came to the door in his bathrobe and said, "Yeah." And I said, "You published the magazine." And he said, "How did you know that?" And that was the closest I ever came to, as a child, to knowing anybody in publishing. But I always really wanted to do it. And then I guess in college, Isaac Asimov came to speak at my school, and he said that he was a full-time writer. I mean, I knew people wrote books. I just didn't know that anybody did it full-time. I was astounded, and but even then, I didn't think I was going to do it. I remember telling people in college, if usually girls, if I could just write one novel, I'll die happy. Just one.
So now you can die 80 times happy.
I'm happy. But I meant it. I mean, at the time, I really meant it. I mean, that was what I wanted to do. What sparked it, I'm not entirely sure. It was just sort of when I saw it, I wanted to do it. I wanted to not only be the reader, but the writer. I wanted to tell these stories, and it's something I don't know exactly. I can't pinpoint any one incident, but I knew I wanted to, and I still want to, and it's an impulse that you just can't shake. It just happens.
Real quick before you jump in, Cirroc, Dennis Koch probably was the most excited when you were added to our schedule. He's one of our favorite people out in Canada. He says he's learned so much about writing from you. So he knows you well,
Yes.
And you're a big influence on him. I don't know if you know him.
I do. We've never met in person, but I do know him.
That's awesome. It seemed the way you were nodding, it seemed like it.
Nice. I have a couple of questions. One, who would you describe as, who would you say is your favorite writer? And two, what is the process that you go through when you're writing a novel? You go on vacation? Do you stay at your house?
Well, in terms of my favorite writer, I mean, I have a few. I'll mention Roger Zelazny, who is a science fiction writer of some note. He won awards, and he won the Hugo Award maybe for Lord of Light, and he was a big inspiration to me. And in fact, my first few books were kind of homages to him, because he would take mythology and kind of treat it in different ways to create characters for his books, and he was just brilliant. A guy named Poul Anderson, who was also a science fiction writer.
Who's that? Cole Anderson?
Poul.
Oh, Poul.
Yeah, Poul. And he was a contemporary also of Zelazny and Asimov, and also a great writer. He won awards. Probably doesn't get enough admiration. I would say Ray Bradbury, certainly Ray Bradbury. There was a time when I would just soak up every bit of Ray Bradbury at the time. He was a poet, and he was a real inspiration. I really wanted to write and I'm afraid I'm not, but I'm happy with the way things turned out. But I'm still not the writer that Bradbury was.
Well, Bradbury's pretty prolific.
Yeah. And then Rod Serling.
Cirroc knows all about Rod Serling.
Right?
Yes, I do.
Rod Serling.
I don't know all about, but I know a little bit.
He was the first writer that I ever saw come forward and say, "Hey, I'm the writer." You know, and
Right.
it wasn't just what he wrote; it was his stature and his image and his passion for what was going on there that I found very, very appealing. So he would be one of my writing heroes as well. And there was another part to the question. I can't remember it, but it was
Cirroc, what was the other
about
half
the
of the
process? Like, yeah,
Right.
just about the process. Yeah, what's your process like? I mean, what's the time length or the place that you like to go to? That kind of thing.
I like to go right here. Sitting here in my office and my wife will tell you, is by far my favorite place on earth. But I've gotten to the point where I can write almost anywhere. It's not maybe as efficient, but I can write almost anywhere by necessity. I just had to get to that point. The process is, I'm more of a plotter than a pantser. If you're familiar with that distinction, I don't just start writing and then hope it goes somewhere. I always
See what happens.
what could go wrong. So so I know where I'm going. Even in a short story, I have a pretty good idea of where I'm going when I start. And then, unlike many other writers, I write the piece of the story that appeals to me at the moment. So if I really like the end, I might write the end first.
That's scary. That is pretty bold to write the ending first, though.
Yeah, but you have to know the ending before you start, I think. So, or at least I do. So I know where it's going, and I don't really find that I'm finished until I've rewritten the beginning. Because when you get to the ending, regardless of when you do it, when you get to the end, it kind of resonates with the beginning. They're bookends. And sometimes you get to the end and you go, wow, I thought the story was about this. It's actually about that. There was a book I wrote called Kalis about, the Klingon religious historical icon. And there was when you write for Star Trek publishing program, again, because there are these two layers of approval, you really have to lay everything out and stick to it. But in this one book, I got near the end and I went, oh, wait a second. Oh, what if that wasn't that? What if it was this? And I couldn't get away from it. And so I told my editor, who communicated with the licensing department, and they said okay. So Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide, he said a writer's only job is to surprise himself. I'm not sure I entirely agree that it's the only job, but it's certainly a job. And when I got to this point in Kalis, I said, "Oh my God!" And I really did surprise myself, and it made I think a much better book than would have had I just stuck to the original outline.
Here's a quick question from Music Mad for both Michael and Cirroc. In your careers, what has been your toughest rejection, and what have you learned from it? It's a good one. Thanks, Sophia. What about you, Mike? What do you think?
That is a great question. I have had a few serious rejections in my life. I'm not gonna go into all of them because that's all we do here, But I can tell you that I wrote my first professional writing was for Quest Star, which was an imprint of Warner, and I wrote 4 books for them. 3 of them I've since re-released independently, and they're about Norse mythology. The 4th one was also about Northern European folklore, and then I had this idea for another book, for an anthology, and I went to the editor there, who was not the editor I started. The editor I started with was an incredible woman, Kathy Malley, who shepherded me through my first 3 books. This guy came along, did the 4th book, and did a credible job. But I was what they call an orphan. When your original editor is no longer there, you're an orphan. And so I said to him, okay, so I have this great idea for another book. And he goes, Mike, kid, he called me, I think we're gonna go in a different direction. They're like, what direction is that? And he goes, like the direction was away from me.
Yeah, one without you.
Right. I'm going in that direction. He is. So I would have to find another direction. And so that was a big rejection. I said, at the time, maybe that's it. Maybe that's all the books I'm supposed to write. And that could be it. And fortunately for me, my editor came to me a couple of weeks later and said, have you ever thought about writing a Star Trek book? And she was in touch with the Star Trek publishing program. And then fortunately for me, it went on from there.
Wow.
But that was a big rejection.
Yeah. Cirroc, did you have a real quick, we're already running low on time, but did you have a big rejection that improved you as an actor or redoubled your efforts?
I've had many rejections in life, and not just as an actor, but just as a human being in general, especially with the ladies. But one thing I can say is that I learned that you have to continue to believe in yourself and have faith and move forward, and not let that rejection define you or break your spirit. It has to be the thing that gives you perspective to know what you can do better, and how you can approach things differently. So I've never let it get me down. I always continue to move forward. But it does hurt when it happens, and it makes you reevaluate where you're at and what your ideas were, what you were thinking. So sometimes it's a good reality check, and sometimes it's motivation to do something else.
Hey, real quick, something we were talking about before we went live, but this is actually a huge thing that we got to mention. Kimber Spores reminds us that Resistance is such a great episode. I think this is the one that you successfully pitched to Star Trek. Had you pitched a lot of ideas and this was the one that was picked, or did you only pitch one, or how did that process go?
Kevin Ryan was my writing partner, my screenwriting partner, and we had pitched to Next Generation several times. We had pitched to Deep Space Nine, to Ron Moore, and this was finally our pitch to Voyager. And we pitched to Jerry Ryan, and we had always, come up with like half a dozen pitches each time, and we had always gotten nibbles, but no bites.
Right.
Yeah, we love that. That's in development. We like that, but it's coming. You're going to see it next week. Or we really like it, but it's in direct conflict with something we're developing on staff. So we always got encouragement, but we've never gotten an actual bite until finally we pitched this idea, and it was a high concept. It was Janeway plays Dulcinea to a Kazon Don Quixote. right? Because the Kazon were the enemies of the
Right.
that season, and Jerry said, "Oh, I like that. I like that. Wow, I like that a lot. Let me share that with the writing staff, and I'll get back to you. We'll talk again tomorrow morning." And so we call her tomorrow morning, and she gets on, and she goes, "Well," she goes, "very interesting." She goes, "First of all, the writing staff loved it, and we are going to produce your episode."
That's awesome.
Whoa, unbelievable! And but she goes, I should tell you that this morning, before we spoke, somebody actually pitched much the same idea. And had you pitched 24 hours later, we would have been forced to take their idea and not
Wow.
just to give you an idea of how many people were pitching and how difficult it was to sell a story idea. But we did, and it was handled so well and so inclusively and so respectfully. You always come across people who tell you about their Hollywood story and how somebody mangled their baby and their soul was crushed. Quite the opposite for us. It was just an amazing, positive, gratifying experience.
Wow. Cirroc, any final thoughts?
So technically, you didn't pitch that story. Yeah, I was just saying, technically, you didn't pitch that story to the writers. Jerry pitched the story for you, technically.
Yeah. So we pitched it to her.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's what happened. I mean, we pitched to her, and then she shared it with the staff, and just to make sure. We had previously pitched to writers, showrunners. The first time we pitched was to Brannon Braga, who had been an intern the week before. So we pitched to everybody at all levels, and but it really that particular time it worked out.
That's a lot of capital letters.
Yeah, right.
Well, we're just about out of time here. But Michael, it feels like there's so much more we could talk about. I really hope to see you again sometime. This has been really cool, really great. And we've left about 75% of the questions we had on the table for next time. But thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
It was absolutely my pleasure. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. And it was great to meet you guys because I hadn't met either one of you previously. And so really quite a pleasure.
Sorry, I was waiting. I know there was a delay for Cirroc, so I was waiting for him to chime in. there he is.
Yeah, right. I say thank you, man. It's been awesome, man. It's been really good talking with you and getting to know more about that side of the business, which is a whole nother separate section.
Right.
Thanks.
Great. So everybody at home, check the link in the description box below, and you'll see the next item up, which is a live video, a live concert from Tim Russ and his band playing in his backyard. Scott Baker, the guy that designs our website, is going there as well. And I said, "Oh, you're going to help produce it?" He said, "No, I'm just going to watch." So that's what he's doing, if anybody's wondering. Everybody click the link below. Check out Tim Russ's band rocking out for the next hour. They're tons of fun, super talented, really good. Michael, Jen, Friedman, really great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. We do truly hope to see you again sometime soon, okay?
Same here.
Great. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll see you all in the next one. After that, we've got Deep Space Nine writers Robert Hewitt-Wolf and Ira Stephen Bear, who will be talking about character development. We're like total writer nerds, by the way, Mike. We love just talking with the writers. It's so fun.
That's in me too.
I believe it. All right, we'll see you next time, guys. See you on the next one in just about an hour. Thanks very much.